there are a lot of questions out there, certainly from our clients and a lot of stakeholders and thought leaders about what the new administration is focusing on when it comes to illicit finance. There's been a lot of consternation, of course, about the declaration of the review of the application of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, with the sense that the U.S. may no longer care about the application of anti-corruption rules and its enforcement under the FCPA. There's been questions as to what's going to happen with Russia sanctions. Will there be concessions as a part of peace deals or some rapprochement between the U.S. and Russia? And there's been questions as to whether or not the administration ultimately cares about questions of money laundering and illicit finance, with the suspension of the registration under the Corporate Transparency Act, where U.S. persons are no longer required to register. It's all now voluntary, and the focus is on foreign countries and foreign companies in terms of that registry. So lots of questions as to what's happening, in addition to the dismantling of the klepto capture group at the Department of Justice, which had been focused on kleptocracy, especially in the Russian context, and the refocusing of attention of other prosecutors and agencies on fentanyl trade and cartels. That said, that's not the complete picture. And what's fascinating is you have a series of things happening from the administration that actually look like refocusing and different elements of attention in the illicit finance space. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think there are 5 areas. One, clearly the administration is going to continue to rely on sanctions to target illicit activity and rogue actors or targeted regimes, as they have in the past. The best example of that is with Iran, where they've committed to a maximum pressure campaign, and where that has begun to play out with designations that we have seen from OFAC, and those designations on sanctions evasion and diversion that are starting to emerge. What's fascinating here is this is not just enforcement isolated to Iran. This is now being driven in part by the reality of the alliance of financial rogues that are starting to interact more and rely on each other more often for commercial and financial reasons. And so the Russian activity and reliance on the Iranians and the North Koreans for their war making in Ukraine, the deals and the oil trade with China, their interactions with Venezuela and with Belarus, all of this represents a sense of collective risk that will be subject to sanctions and sanctions scrutiny under each of those programs, and collectively in the form of sanctions tied to sanctions evasion. And so you're going to see some very interesting sanctions maneuvers, I think, as part of the maximum pressure campaign, but also to get at the facilitation that is occurring in the context of that alliance of financial and commercial rogues. We've already heard the president talk directly to the BRICS countries, the expanded BRICS countries, about moving toward alternates to the use of the dollar. So the president is already focused and has demonstrated a willingness to look at the collective group of countries that are trying to create alternatives to the U.S. or trying to do other things to evade a U.S. scrutiny or U.S. system. So I think you're going to see more actions in that regard. Secondly, you've seen the use of tariffs in a fairly aggressive way, and most recently in a way that looks an awful lot like secondary sanctions. And so with the administration announcing that tariffs, 25% tariffs would be placed on those importing Venezuelan oil, you now see the convergence of sanctions and tariffs playing out in the administration, and the use of tariffs in a secondary sanction way to punish those that are willing to deal and do business with Venezuela. It's another element of pressure. It's another form of economic statecraft. And it shows that the administration is willing to actually use tariffs in a fairly creative way to target a regime, to target a form of trade or a sector that is a vulnerability for that target, in this case, oil in Venezuela. So that's a second dimension here where the tariffs are going to grow in importance. Certainly we've seen that with China. It's going to continue to be a source of of targeting of Chinese goods, technology investment, that is certainly going to be part of the economic statecraft of this administration. Third part of what we've seen is the focus on fentanyl and cartels. Now, some have seen this as an obsession of the border, or maybe even as an excuse to use tariffs against Canada and Mexico. But the reality is the administration is clearly focusing enforcement, law enforcement, and regulatory attention on fentanyl networks. You have agencies that perhaps heretofore have never really looked at counter-narcotics networks directly now being enlisted, the intelligence community, parts of law enforcement now being focused on fentanyl networks. What that means is these networks are not just focused on what's coming across the border, but looking at the cartels that are profiting from the fentanyl trade, certainly in Mexico, but also those shipping precursors from China. And if you'll recall, Congress, the bipartisan committee looking at the Chinese Communist Party, issued a report last year focusing on not just the supplies of fentanyl and precursors from China to Mexico, but also the collusion that was happening between the Chinese Communist Party and those suppliers. And so the question of how China, the Mexican cartels, and trade across the border is amplifying and creating fentanyl risk in the U.S. is going to become more and more a focus. And that gets to the financial infrastructure of these organizations, the supply chains, all the way back into China that the administration is going to be looking at. So that will push emphasis on the drug money laundering networks that are fueling this. Fourth, you have now the openness and the willingness to promote the use of crypto and crypto technologies and digital payments in this administration. President Trump has declared he wants the U.S. to be the crypto capital of the world. He's pushing forward with the strategic Bitcoin reserve, with the allowances for the marketplace of stablecoins to emerge. Congress is reacting with the Genius Act, which is the legislation that will set the four corners of regulation for stablecoins. All of this is happening where it appears like there's a lessening of regulation and enforcement in the crypto ecosystem, but there will also be more regulation and more risk maturation as there's a legitimate market defined and then an illegitimate market will emerge and will be targeted. And so over time, you're going to see more and more crypto activity that targets that nefarious behavior, whether driven by the North Koreans, criminal cartels, or other state and non-state actors. So that's going to be an interesting arena to watch, because it's not going to be ollie oxen free for illicit activity. It's actually going to be a moment of risk maturation and maybe even some more targeted activity from U.S. law enforcement and the intelligence community. Fifth, and the last thing I'll note, is the consolidation, the crystallization of a national economic security framework for how the administration is thinking about the use of power. Now, one way to look at this is the administration is engaged in a lot of transactional activity, a lot of tit for tat, economic benefit in diplomatic relations. But another way of looking at this is the administration's looking at the use of economic and financial power through a variety of new lenses to try to influence the environment, to expand the use of economic statecraft. And in that regard, the use of positive economic power, how we think about U.S. capital, U.S. investment, comes to the fore. The administration has laid out the America First investment security strategy, which lays out a desire to work with allies and allied capital to bring capital into the U.S., to isolate capital and investments in China and in other countries like Iran and Venezuela, and frankly, to fast track investments into the U.S. that does not have links to those nefarious economies and governments. And so there's a desire, I think, to begin to think about investment as a form of power, capital as a form of national security, that forms a part of what this administration is doing. And the extreme part of this is, and what's novel is this idea of a sovereign wealth fund for the U.S., which is now being studied by the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department. That would ultimately become an interesting form of investment by the U.S. in key technologies, perhaps key industries, key supply chains, and key infrastructure around the world. I think you're going to see more and more of this, the use of positive economic power, the use of investment as capital, directed either directly by the U.S. or the U.S. government drawing down risk to allow the private sector to step into some of these key places and key investments. And so the administration, I think, is unfolding a lot of activity. It's sometimes hard to keep track, but I think those are some key issues to keep an eye on as they begin to actually govern. They have to wonder and manage about the risks that are emerging in the system, and they actually have to then counter the use of systems, technologies by illicit actors, including state and non-state actors. So we'll continue to watch this, but I think this is a more complicated picture than simply the administration cares about this or that. There are certain things that they clearly care about, and they are going to be affecting the world of illicit finance and national security.